Good morning. Thanks to all of you for being with us this morning. Really excited to have you with us tuning into this next segment in our Friday morning gatherings as we highlight innovative education leaders, cutting edge education ideas from all across the state and really across the nation. We know that despite so many challenges that families, students, and educators are facing during the pandemic, we've really been impressed by how K-12 education, post-secondary education leaders are responding, and also how they really remain firmly focused on creating even greater opportunities for students, both now and in the future. And in the spirit of SCORE's commitment and our mission that we work to catalyze innovative change, and in our core values as an organization that many of the most difficult challenges in education can be solved through creative and innovative solutions, we want to highlight innovators, entrepreneurs, and leaders from really all across the country who are leading the way. Our goal each week is to pick a single topic, a single cutting edge idea, and do a deep dive to quickly learn more. Hearing from entrepreneurs and innovators, and hopefully to trigger some thoughts or ideas that you can take away and apply in your own daily work. I know how busy everyone is, so we're going to keep these sessions brief and informal, although we would ask, obviously, that if you have any questions as we go through this session, to feel free to drop that in the chat box. This morning, I'm really excited to welcome Paymon Rouhanifard, who's the co-founder and CEO of Propel America, an organization dedicated to helping young adults, especially those coming from low economic backgrounds, access an affordable and quick pathway to a college education and a good paying job. Propel does this by bringing together high schools, higher education institutions, and employers in a unified system of skill building, job placement, and ongoing support and planning for young adults that they serve. So let me quickly introduce Paymon, and then we'll get right to it. Paymon Rouhanifard actually spent his youth growing up here in Middle Tennessee before going on to University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and then starting his career in the financial industry. He then made a big career shift, becoming a sixth grade teacher in West Harlem, and later working in the central offices of the New York City Department of Education and Newark Public Schools. He was named superintendent of public schools in Camden, New Jersey, and served from 2013 to 2018. We really got high marks in helping lead improvements in student outcomes, reductions in out-of-school suspensions, stronger family engagement, and critical capital investments in school facilities. Today is the co-founder and CEO of Propel America. He and co-founder John White, former state superintendent of schools in Louisiana, are creating an exciting new model to help many more students realize their full potential. So please join me in welcoming Paymon. And Paymon, let me turn it over to you first to share a little bit about the overview of the work you're doing, how you came to this work, the model you're creating at Propel, and maybe any results you're seeing in the states that you're working in, and then we'll follow up with some questions. So Paymon, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, David. That is far too kind of an intro, and really thrilled to be here with y'all to reconnect with folks from my home state who are doing really important work. And I've been following your leadership at SCORE from the cheap seats, and just grateful for all that you're doing. So I'll give you the quick founding story of Propel and set the table, and hopefully, as you mentioned, just jump into some dialogue. So in Camden, you touched on some of the trends that we saw, and just deep pride in improvements that happen inside the four walls of classrooms, whether that was test scores or graduation rates or declines in suspension rates. There were a lot of positive indicators that things were moving in the right direction. And at the same time, I had this dawning realization that our graduates were stopping out of traditional colleges at enormously high rates, and saw it anecdotally in alumni who I was personally connected to and still am, but certainly in the data. And just started questioning what it is that we can be doing, because the reality for those students is that they are entering the labor market with debt and little additional earning ability. And there are very few systems, if any, that are designed to support them. And so that was probably like midway through my 5 years when I was superintendent in Camden, New Jersey, that the wheels started to go into motion. And so Propel is just fundamentally a byproduct of those lived experiences. And so John White, my co-founder, he and I worked together in the New York City Department of Education. He had similar experiences when he was state superintendent of education in Louisiana. And we quixotically pursued what we call a third way solution for students like the ones we were serving And what we mean by that is we're trying to address what we believe to be a false choice that really all high school graduates face, but particularly those from historically marginalized communities, which is you either have to forestall income and accrue debt in pursuit of a traditional degree, or you have to forestall education and mobility to take an entry-level job with very limited opportunities for advancement. And so why can't there be some sort of merger of those two kind of paths that are put in front of students? And the model that we've developed at Propel, we believe to be that third way solution, and we term it jobs first higher education. And so for us, jobs first higher education requires higher ed to behave differently. It requires employers to behave differently. And the third leg of the stool being NGOs like Propel, who are on the ground to help systematize the transition from high school diploma to a good job that includes traditional higher educational experiences. And so to give you the very quick and dirty version of what this looks like on the ground, Propel builds employer partnerships in high growth sectors with focusing on jobs that the industry term is middle skill, so under 1 year of training typically. And we bring in traditional higher ed as a partner to then create Pell eligible credentialing programs that critically stack into associate and bachelor's degrees. And so 6 months or less for the most part in terms of the length of training programs, a young person 18 to 24 years of age can get a living wage job. We focus on healthcare at Propel. There's certainly other NGOs who are doing similar work in IT and advanced manufacturing and skilled trades. And so not only do they get the living wage job, but they get roughly 20 to 25 college credits that through our partner higher ed institution, it's an organization based out of Chicago, a nonprofit called National Louis University. Those credits cleanly articulate every single last credit into any associate degree they want to pursue at National Louis. And then similarly, those credits articulate cleanly into a bachelor's degree. And so at the heart of jobs first higher education is a novel yet simple concept, which is what if traditional higher ed actually built credential through bachelor's degree programming that was intentional in design? Because right now the reality is when a student or any person in our country wants to get a workforce certification and later on they decide they want to get an associate's degree and later on maybe they want to get a bachelor's degree, they're navigating 3 disparate institutions and bearing enormous transaction costs and actual costs because the credits rarely transfer over. I would argue that's one of the great sins of higher education, the inability to transfer credits from one institution to another. So it's to create a much more cohesive and connected training system that connects to the needs of the labor market. And right now we're in this moment in time, tightest labor market in the history of our country, at least since we've been tracking it mid-century, 10 million vacant jobs, particularly in sectors like healthcare. And so employers are really focused on building talent pipelines to reduce turnover costs, because in some cases it's an existential matter for them. And so we have this opportunity, I believe, to connect these dots and to put young people who need that more rapid pathway to economic stability to lead a choice-filled life. But we've got to design and build those systems first because they don't exist right now. So that's the work we've taken on. We're still a very young organization. We're about 2.5 years since we launched. We're operating in 5 states, small presence across those 5 states. We started in New Jersey and Louisiana because of me and my co-founders' pre-existing relationships. I now live in Boston, so we're in the state of Massachusetts. We're also in Providence, Rhode Island, and Philadelphia. And it's been really joyous and hard work to help rethink post-secondary pathways for incredibly deserving young adults. And our early outcomes, you asked about outcomes, are really encouraging. We've had a few different phases of pilot programming, and where we've really coalesced our energy is this notion of jobs first higher education. So we have national higher education partners. We hope that we would have multiple in time. There are very few higher ed institutions that are thinking innovatively like National Louis. We have a few national employer partners. And our completion rate for our students is roughly 75–80%. based on the latest cohorts that we've been serving, which we're really proud of when you compare that to community college completion rates, which depending upon the system, sometimes it's south of 10%. So we feel good about where we are. We've made 1 million mistakes. We'll make 1 million more. We're learning from them, and just feel really grateful to be doing this work.
Awesome. Paymon, maybe just to start, to help kind of illustrate what this looks like in practice, I'm wondering if you could talk about, from the student's perspective, you have a student who's part of this work, like what does it look like for that student, maybe from high school through to, through the sort of post-secondary experience to a credential, like, can you walk through like what that looks like for a student who's part of a partnership that you have?
Yeah, so we recruit students through essentially 2 vehicles. The first is high school partnerships we have, and we have created a proprietary curriculum, which is about, and this is a course that high school seniors take, typically second semester, it can be first. And essentially it is about building a sense of identity. What are my strengths? What am I good at? Then connecting that to what are the opportunities for employment in my local economy, regional economy, and just really basic things like, what is a living wage? What does that look like? In terms of a job at the Verizon store versus a middle skill job, and the differences in mobility. And then lastly, you build a career map. Where do I want to be 1, 3, 5, 10 years from now? It's okay if you don't know where you want to be 10 years from now. I sure as heck didn't know when I was 17, but at least you should be, the wheels should be in motion, and you should at least have some longer term orientation. And so those students take the course, and so Propel then becomes accessible to them through that course. The course is designed so any young person in the country would benefit from it. But if they so choose to apply into our program, it's right there and available to them, because the high schools bought into what it is we're doing, and we give them the curriculum for free, and we give them technical assistance support and all that. The other vehicle, we do just community-wide recruiting. And the typical profile of those students are, they started at a community college or a traditional four-year college, and they stopped out, and they're working somewhere. And so, it's interesting for us. We are very connected to school systems, because we do want to push on those gears and to be a part of the systems change and to change behaviors inside of schools. So a lot of times our older students come through the high school kind of connection. It'll be an older sibling, a friend, an alumnus. And so that is really important to us, to be tethered to the systems we are hoping to change in the longer term. And so that's where we'll see our typical student. And then they go through an orientation session, which is roughly 2 to 3 days. And that for them is an ability to really understand, what does it mean to be a certified medical assistant? What does it mean to be a registered behavioral technician, and the other healthcare pathways we have? And the purpose of that is really a mutual match to ensure that they know what they're getting themselves into. And we do some light screening as well at that phase. And it's really just about fire in the belly. That's all we're looking for. Those who are really interested and committed and fired up about it. And from there, it's a tuition-free experience. They get a modest stipend, and they get weekly coaching sessions from us through the entirety of their training program, which is on average about 6 months.
So, and then I think maybe the other question I would have from the student perspective. So obviously this is like a unique partnership experience, perhaps higher touch. Talk about maybe scale. Like, is this something, how are you thinking about growing? Perhaps maybe how quickly can you grow given the high touch and sort of, kind of unique partnerships that you're building? It seems like there's a lot of intentionality around that. So what does that look like to scale?
It's such a good question. And it's like you're sitting in on our leadership team discussions, because we intentionally did a very kind of wide, far-reaching, very diverse set of pilots to better understand, well, what does it feel like to do this work in advanced manufacturing and IT and healthcare and skilled trades? We partnered with brick and mortar community colleges, and then we shifted gears to the national kind of virtual delivery model. So I should have mentioned National Lewis delivers their technical skill training program online, while we do the on the ground, work to recruit and coach students and place them into jobs. And so I say all that to say, we have decided to create radical simplicity, and trying to borrow a bit from the private sector here. I often say nonprofits and governmental agencies, they have both and mentalities. So any new initiative, and let's do that, and let's do this, and let's do this. And I live this, you know, as a superintendent. And I think if we're gonna, to your point and question, systematize our model and create scale and sustainability, we need to focus as much as possible. And that's why we put all our eggs in healthcare, and for good reason. 20% of GDP, 2.5 million new jobs coming online by 2030. And you know, at this point, just a single higher ed partner. And we're only looking for big national employer partnerships. We have some regional employer partnerships, but we're trying to create as much simplicity as possible so that we can deliver our programmatic model for our students. I mean, really, that's the thing that's our locus of control. We've created a professional skills curriculum that's scripted, deployed out of a box anywhere in the country. And this is the thing that CEOs and hiring managers talk about the most. It's less about the technical skills. It's more about what professional skills they show up with. How do they comport themselves in a complex environment? How do they navigate conflict in a workplace? How do they write a business email? You know, things like that. And so that's really kind of our focus, and that's what we're hoping to scale.
Got it. So I want to shift to talking perhaps about the impact of the last 2 years on this work. So you mentioned, I think that you launched 2.5 years ago, right? So right, maybe a year before the pandemic. And obviously we know, at least in Tennessee, and I'm certainly across the country, that the pandemic has had huge impacts on post-secondary going rates, post-secondary persistence rates. And I think, to your point earlier, this is perhaps most pronounced at the community college level, where we've seen just big drops in community college enrollment, particularly for lower income students and students of color. And so would be interested in hearing about how you're thinking about any impacts related to the pandemic. Has that changed how you're thinking about your work? Or is there anything that Propel's doing to try to address some of those decreases in post-secondary going rates, or perhaps the ways in which students are getting connected to the post-secondary experience after high school graduation?
Yeah. So community college enrollment, I think the latest clearinghouse data showed what, a 14% decline over the last 2 years, which is striking, given those institutions are obviously there to serve our most vulnerable students. You know, we are pushing traditional higher ed to rethink, again, credential to associate to bachelor's degrees. And I should say, we set out partnering with brick and mortar community colleges. I am personally a deep admirer of Governor Haslam and all the work he did in Tennessee with the community college system. The thing I still struggle with the most is, for the most part, across the country, a community college workforce credentialing arm is fundamentally siloed from the academic side. And that's in essence one of the problems we're addressing, because the workforce side, by virtue of not interacting and collaborating with the academic side, first of all, these are not Pell eligible programs, and students have to figure out financing their tuition. Workforce development boards ostensibly exist for that reason, but I will tell you, and we tried to do this with the first phase of our pilot, that is not for the faint of heart to try and access WIOA dollars through workforce development boards, which are fundamentally decentralized, very political, kind of patronage politics at their worst. Some are more functional than others. So if there's anyone on this Zoom who's affiliated with the WIB, I'm not casting shade, but I can tell you I've got a lot of scars on my back trying to systematize access to those funds. And so, you know, with Title IV, you have the most significant recurring visible source of federal revenue in the post-secondary education system. And all it takes is for the workforce side to create programming that articulates into the academic side and get you to an associate degree. Now, then going to a bachelor's degree is a whole nother thing, and you need articulation agreements and the like. But that's where we've hit a lot of headwinds. And what we're working around by asking a traditional four-year college in National Louis to build downward. Perhaps it'll kind of spur innovation from community colleges. We want to work with community colleges. We just need them to structurally provide a better pathway for our students that can be financed.
What does that look like? So if you were to talk to a community college leader about the work that you're doing, I mean, what does that look like? What would they be doing differently?
sit down with your academic dean, workforce people, and have a conversation. I mean, it's really actually not that hard. Oftentimes what it means is the credentialing program needs to, in order to meet the Title IV eligibility criteria, they need to add a couple more courses. They need to make it a little bit longer, which, by the way, is annoying, right? Like it adds time to get to a living wage job, but it also comes with college credits that if you build the right design, you build the right system for students, those credits then articulate into an associate's degree that employers will recognize. And we haven't talked as much about the role of employers in all this, and if we have time, we should.
Yeah.
But there is a way to devise, an experience for students that is as simple as just the workforce side collaborating and communicating with the academic side. And I've sort of just been stunned by how little that actually exists.
Yeah. So it's a good segue, Paymon, because I wanted to talk a little bit about the employer perspective. And we hear a lot of times about the kind of sometimes challenges that employers have in engaging with post-secondary institutions around building the sort of pipeline that's needed. We had a previous guest on one of our Friday conversations talking a bit about kind of data science and information systems needs in Tennessee, and there are 4,000 job openings or so every year in that field, and only about 2,000 students who are coming out of post-secondary institutions with a credential or degree ready to sort of engage in that field. And so I think, hearing more and more about employers who are sort of purpose building these pipelines into institutions or into workplaces, and sort of driving that change at the post-secondary level, building that sort of building that themselves. And one of the things that's also sort of stands out in a lot of those conversations is that work is not corporate social responsibility work. It is like literally, strategy, HR, talent building work for those employers. And so would love to hear like what that employer partnership looks like for you, what expectations you have for employers if they're going to engage in the work that you're doing, maybe any lessons learned that you've seen so far in terms of what worked and what didn't in terms of kind of employer engagement in this work.
Yeah, the thing that I've become obsessed with is essentially what is asked of, what is necessary of employers to deliver on this notion of job service higher education, because it's simple to say it's the right thing for young adults who are low income and need that scaffolding, right, to get to economic stability, but not foreclose future higher educational attainment. But does that make sense for employers? And we are fundamentally an employer-driven nonprofit. I believe in capitalism. I believe in the role of employers, and you have to work with them, because handing someone a credential and asking them to go fish is not sufficient. And so the way that we have worked our way through this is in many ways serendipitous because of the current labor environment. And so just to make it much more concrete, so big national home healthcare companies, hugely supply constrained market, and Medicaid reimbursements standing to go up, at least based on the latest stimulus package being negotiated. But for certain jobs, really well-paying jobs. So the one path we were working on right now is in the applied behavioral analysis space. And this is to serve young people with autism spectrum disorder in a clinical setting, at home and at school. So essentially a paraprofessional. The job is called registered behavioral technician. You can get it in 40 hours of training from any crappy online certification mill, 1 week, and it's $20 an hour. But here's the rub. The next rung on the ladder at almost all of these companies is a BCABA. I should know what it stands for, but it's a bachelor's degree. And it's essentially a special ed teacher. So you can imagine someone who walks in the door with a week of training and they're making $20 an hour, which is obviously like decent for 1 week of training, better than decent. The next rung on the ladder it's a chasm to get there. And so very few get to that next rung, and they end up seeing a lot of churn. And because of the labor market now, the employers are forced to think differently. And so enter Propel and enter National Lewis. And we said to our national partner, it's called Bayada Home Healthcare. It's one of the largest home healthcare companies in the world. What if instead of a 40-hour program, we create a Pell eligible 12 to 16 week program, and we create out of thin air an associate's degree that you honor with some modest increase in wages. And so when you create it that way, they get the RBT credential, like a supercharged version of it. They're halfway to an associate's degree. And then they get the associate's degree, and Beata has committed to increase wages 30 to 40% once they get it. And now all of a sudden they're halfway to becoming a special education teacher, which is their other really critical hiring need, which they've really struggled with. And so you're investing in the person, in the employee, but you're creating employee satisfaction that's going to reduce your turnover costs at a time when you're struggling to retain and find talent. And so you're playing the long game. And a lot of times, as we know, it's hard to do that when you're bottom line oriented, and especially if you're a public company. But you're seeing much more of that mentality from employers. And it's been really inspiring to be able to do this work. Now, it's early days. We've got a lot to work out, but that's sort of what we're talking about.
Awesome. I also just want to remind folks who are joining us, if you have any questions for Paymon, feel free to drop it in the chat box, and I'll be sure to tee it up before we close out here in about 10 minutes or so. Paymon, one other question I had, we obviously, a lot of folks that SCORE works with are engaging predominantly on the K-12 side. So we do a lot of work with superintendents, school leaders, community partners who are supporting K-12 institutions and districts in our state. And there's also, I think, a lot of work happening in the state around better connecting K-12 experiences with post-secondary workforce needs, particularly at a time where the economy in Tennessee is booming. We've got lots of new industries moving here. Big announcement from Ford, as an example, that they're going to build a plant West Tennessee that I think is really just a game changer for economic development and jobs, workforce development, everything in that region of the state. And would be curious about any thoughts or advice you would have for K-12 leaders who are thinking more about work in this space. Obviously, you've got a unique experience here because you were district leader, right? You spent a lot of time in the K-12 world, and now you're thinking a lot more about kind of post-secondary and workforce connections. And so would be just interested in any advice, challenge you would give, sort of places to sort of focus and engage in the K-12 space specifically.
Yeah, well, I don't know if this has been your experience, but when I first set out to do this work, there's a stigma that I find a lot of super talented K-12 leaders place on workforce, and they view it as sort of lesser than your typical higher educational experience. And I viewed part of our charge to destigmatize this work and to call on the importance of, first of all, there's honor in all work. And secondly, economic stability is just fundamentally necessary to lead a choice-filled life. It's just applying Maslow's hierarchy of needs to those who have grown up with lower incomes in historically marginalized communities. And I would just posit that having this one-size-fits-all higher education post-secondary planning model for, I'm thinking about my friends and colleagues at really high performing charter management organizations who have a 4-year college pennant hanging in every classroom and hallway, and as well they should. But for some students, we are arguably making things worse by placing them, throwing them into the deep end, having them forego income, accruing debt, in pursuit of that traditional degree, when we can create on-ramps and off-ramps that might actually better situate their lives. And so that's what I found to be the push that we've helped provide a lot of, again, incredibly talented, well-intentioned K-12 leaders that only sort of see traditional higher ed as the answer and workforce as being some lesser than option. And so you're exactly right. I mean, particularly in states like Tennessee, where at least on the state policy front, workforce is a very kind of positive issue, and there's a lot of energy there. To be able to connect those dots and to understand there are third way solutions. That doesn't mean we have to foreclose future higher educational attainment. It doesn't mean this, it doesn't mean that. So that's sort of been the dialogue I feel like I've been having for the last 2.5 years.
All right, and then we've got a question here that I'll tee up here to you, Paymon. So how do you select the states and geographies you're working in? What are you looking for in terms of partnerships between public school systems, community colleges, employers, or is that the work that you all are doing in terms of pulling those partners together? So how are you thinking about where you're going to go next?
Yeah, well, it starts with employer commitment. So we strive to be really intentional about that, and to balance supply with demand, and work backwards from vacant job needs, and not out of CSR offices and directly with C-suite and talent folks. And so where we feel, and again, we're focused on healthcare, where we feel we have a real meaningful commitment from at least one or two big employers that we can, place 50 to 75 to 100 of our students into. That's when we start to really push things forward. There's obviously some philanthropic need, but the employer commitments loom large. And we are also seeking to have a balance of red and blue states. I mean, we do want to show that this work is possible in urban and rural communities around the country, and we've learned a lot of lessons, being in Louisiana and New Jersey. So those are the headline thoughts.
All right, last question. So I'm asking this question every week to do a little bit of kind of forecasting, looking ahead. And so if we were to look sort of to 2040, 20 years from now, 19 years from now, what do you predict will be the biggest or should be the biggest change in how we think about K-12 and higher education? I mean, I think in many ways you're at the forefront of what should look different, but give us some forecasting. What do you hope for 20 years down the road?
I know you asked this of all your guests, and I love that you asked it, because I love taking the long view on things. And I really hope jobs first higher education becomes a normalized term, a model. We break down this silo between workforce and higher ed. There are really easy, low-hanging fruit, structural solutions. Other countries like Switzerland and Germany have already instituted them, and we don't have to copy and paste. We can build a version that makes the most sense for our country and our system of federalism. I would say on K-12 more specifically, I don't know if this is a trend I am pleased with, but I think state testing is going to be fundamentally different, maybe even 5-10 years from now, with Governor DeSantis doing away with the summative test in Florida. I think you're going to see a lot more states drop their end of year state test. And I'm someone who actually I've been fairly critical of sort of over obsessing with test scores, but I fundamentally believe in test measuring systems. And if we don't have a summative test to measure systems, I think that's hugely problematic, and it puts a lot of pressure on formative and interim assessments to show us what's actually happening inside of schools and classrooms. I think virtual delivery of education is going to become increasingly normalized coming out of the pandemic. I was someone who was very skeptical of virtual schooling prior to the pandemic. When we shifted gears at Propel to build a virtual model out of necessity, I've walked out of it with a greater sense of possibility. And I think specifically, virtual school sucks, right? Like going 8 to 3 virtually sucks. And I lived that as a parent of a second grader. But I think smaller doses, be it a credentialing program for a few hours a week, or tutoring. I think virtual tutoring is really going to skyrocket, and in a way it has already, and folks don't even know it. So I think really interesting and innovative uses of digital curriculum, for example. Teachers are far more likely today. It's actually sticking, utilizing common sense medias and Newsellas of the world in the classroom. It's been fascinating to see that play out.
Awesome. All right. So we said we were going to keep these to less than 45 minutes. So I want to respect everyone's time this morning. But just want to say thank you again, Paymon, for being with us, sharing about the exciting work you're doing at Propel. I think so much of this work is really front and center for folks who are doing this work in Tennessee, both the K-12 level at the higher level as well, and just really inspired by the work you're doing. And I think it's given us a lot to think about. Before we close, want to also invite folks to join us next time. We'll reconvene in about 2 weeks, same time on Friday, November 12th. And we'll be announcing our special guest for that conversation shortly. Look for the registration info. We'll also have a link to this morning's session and all of our sessions we've done on our YouTube page, and we'll be sharing that information out via email as well. Thank you all again for joining us. Paymon, thanks again for being with us. Have a great day, a great weekend. Look forward to seeing everyone soon. Thank you again.